All right. Hey, business law students. And we are going to jump into the other handout, labor unions handout, which I gave out earlier in the week. I'll attach a copy of this if you didn't get it, a hard copy. Otherwise, you can just take notes on this lecture. So I'm going to jump right in here and share my screen. And so we're going to talk about labor unions. We've been talking a lot about labor unions, and you saw the movie, the American Dream documentary about the Hormel factory strike in the 1980s, which is just a long line of very difficult labor relations history in the United States, which I'm going to try and cover here a little bit with you. So first slide here. During the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, the big movement was from agricultural jobs to factory jobs, where people would work for themselves on a farm versus working for other people. And what ends up happening is large numbers of people leave the farms and move to the big cities and get into these large workplaces, workshops, factories, if you will. You're going to hear the term shop a lot in this lecture in reference to a place of work, a factory, if you will. So if I say, a union shop or an agency shop, uh, we're talking about a place of work, not necessarily like a place to go shopping, but a union situation like a factory or something like that. So um, there were way more laborers, people who were looking for jobs, than there were jobs available in these factories. With high supply in economics class, with high supply and low demand, you're going to have low prices, or in other words, low wages. And management could pick and choose. They had a lot of people to choose from. So they didn't have to do anything to attract workers. They had way more workers than they needed. And so therefore, management and owners of these factories and shops could treat their workers like crap. They could pay them extremely low wages, and the working conditions in general were not that great. So some of the first workers to unionize or come together and work as a team against the management, against the owner, were the craft unions or the craft guilds. If you follow any fantasy books or anything like that, Middle Ages, you'd know that craft guilds were groups of craftsmen, people who had skilled trades, skilled labor, whether it's a bricklayer or a tailor or um, cooks, people who made different products with skilled labor. They would call them craft guilds. And so these craft guilds were the first unions. The first official union was called the Knights of Labor. And this was right after the Civil War. And they were a group of tailors, as in clothing tailors from Philadelphia. And they were able to band together and use their power to negotiate better wages, better working conditions. But at this time, the idea of what a union was didn't really exist. So there were no laws that protected union members, nor any laws that helped, or hurt union members, like they would help management, for example. So it was kind of like the Wild West of labor relations at this time. Bosses were treating their workers not so great, and at the same time, workers were starting to hold a lot of animosity, and they were banding themselves together in these large labor groups. Labor unions is what they will become to be known. Some historic conflicts I want to go through in the next couple of slides. I'm just going to briefly, almost read from each slide, but 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, rail workers basically were protesting their wage cuts. They didn't like the fact that they had to take pay cuts, but not too particularly violent. Several years later, we have the Haymarket Riot. This is a very famous strike slash riot that occurred in Chicago. A bomb was thrown, police were there. Um, the original May Day holidays, which later will become what we know as Labor Day, the holiday called Labor Day, came from the Haymarket Riot, a memorial of the number of people that died. You can see here that I put lots of dead people, okay, during the Haymarket Riot. 1892, the Homestead Strike. Now, if you had me for history class, you remember this is one of the robber barons, U.S. Steel, um, Andrew Carnegie's Homestead factory in Pennsylvania. The workers went on strike, and it got violent. The Homestead factory manager um, hired a group of private police force, the Pinkerton guards, and they were blocking the scabs. And if you remember from the movie that we just watched, scabs were the replacement workers. And obviously the workers that are on strike, they don't want their jobs replaced, so they're not going to be very nice to the scabs. And so there was a lot of violence, and as you can see here, lots of dead people. 1894, another famous strike, the Pullman Railroad strike, Railroad Cars Company strike. And this was actually led by Eugene Debs. He was a socialist, probably we'd call him a communist, but he was also, he later becomes a failed presidential candidate. Police get involved, and once again, lots of dead people. Continuing that theme, about a decade later, the Ludlow Massacre, mine workers this time. J.D. Rockefeller was the robber baron. And we know him as the oil and mine billionaire. And there were machine guns involved, and guess what? Lots of dead people. 1916, Everett Massacre in Washington. This was the International Workers of the World, the IWW, and this group was a well-known group of communists, and they were attempting to negotiate better working conditions for the workers, and guess what? Lots of dead people. The Battle of Matewan, which was mine workers in West Virginia. And again, management brings in private police force, private detectives hired by the company, and lots of dead people. This one actually you can find probably on Netflix or Amazon, but this story later became a Hollywood movie. Then you got 1930s, the Ford, right here in Dearborn, Michigan, the Ford plant shootings. Police are involved, and of course, lots of dead people. So what's going on here? So unions and management through this that history of about 40 years, at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, you had the beginnings of the labor movement, and a Wild West scenario where there's not very many laws to protect either the union or management. And so to protect their interests, there are a lot of physical clashes and violent clashes. So finally, Congress gets involved, and they pass the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, which later, well, it's also known as the Wagner Act. This was one of your questions in asynchronous homework earlier in the week. But it protects the union members from unfair labor practices. This law will really strengthen and legitimize unions and allow them to exist. It allows workers to not fear being fired if they even talk about being in a union or join the union, participate in the unions. Their right to go on strike is protected with the Wagner Act. Their right to engage in collective bargaining, which is the idea that not each worker will bargain with the boss, but one or a small team of workers will negotiate a contract that covers all the workers. So every individual worker doesn't have to go into the boss and say, well, pay me this much. And then another worker says, pay me this much, and they might get paid different amounts, and there'd be jealousy, animosity amongst the workers. They would all earn basically the same rates of pay, and they would negotiate the same safer, better working conditions. And so this is called collective bargaining. And this is protected by the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act as well. And so after the Wagner Act, this National NLRB, National Labor Relations Board or Act, comes into existence right during the Great Depression, by the way, 1935. We still have labor and management having conflict, but guess what? 1936, the great sit-down strike of Flint, Michigan. Also, Ford Motor Company. Guess what? No dead people. All right. Later on, 1938, Fair Labor Standards Act is passed. This is the one that bans child labor, establishes the 40-hour work week, minimum wages, improves working conditions for all workers, helped negotiated or at least lobbied for by these now stronger unions. World War II happens, 1940s. We get a lot of workers coming back to jobs in the mining, auto industry, oil workers. And they were really worried about continuity of commerce, making sure that though none of those industries shut down during and immediately after World War II, it would endanger our, not just our economy, but our entire society if we depend on natural resources and oil to run our tanks and jeeps and to build planes and so forth to help in the world, the war effort. What they find though toward the end of the 1940s is that unions have had all these laws passed that protect them, and that they invent these unfair labor practices against management. But management now is saying, hey, there are some things, the unions are becoming too strong. There are some things that the unions are doing that management now needs protection from. And so subsequently, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was passed. And this one doesn't necessarily weaken unions, but it just gives management a little bit ammunition to be able to say, hey, we now have to play by rules when negotiating by unions. You unions should also have to play by rules and not be unfair and take advantage of labor relations as well. And so the Taft-Hartley Act first and foremost, bans unfair labor practices by unions. And some of these are cooling off periods for strikes, meaning negotiations break down and you can immediately go into a situation where you can, I'm going to stop sharing here for a quick moment. And, oh, I'm still sharing. Okay. So it allows for these cooling off periods where before they go on strike, they have to wait a certain time period to see if cooler heads can prevail and avoid the strike. It also bans secondary boycotts and secondary pickets. So what those are is, if, for example, I work for an automobile factory and my automobile factory deals with this independent dealership in this town, let's say Nestor Chevrolet, all right, and right here in Roscommon. If the auto workers started asking people not to buy things from Nestor Chevrolet, or that would be a secondary boycott, or they would actually picket Nestor Chevrolet. They're not the business that we actually work for, but they deal with the business that we work for. And so a secondary boycott or a secondary picket is the labor going after other businesses that are associated with your business that you're trying to go on strike or that you have an issue with. These are called secondary boycotts. Another example might be, let's say you work in the Nike factory, and what's one of those tennis shoe, the Finish Line retail stores. All right, if you're a Nike worker and you go and you picket and tell people, do not buy goods from the Finish Line retail stores. They handle Nike goods and Nike is unfair to its workers. That would be a secondary boycott, excuse me, a secondary picket, calling for a secondary boycott for people not to buy their goods. And so those are made illegal by the Taft-Hartley Act. Right to work laws. Each individual state can pass laws that actually allows union members to pick or choose whether they want to be in a union. When you join a union, you generally have to pay union dues, an amount of money to help support the union. And some people feel like that money is worth it. Other union members feel like it's not worth it. And so if I don't feel like my union is working for me, then I can drop out of the union. And so we call those right to work laws. And the different states, many states passed them. There are many states that still have not passed right to work laws. Jurisdictional strikes are similar to what you saw in the documentary about the Hormel, roving pickets, going and go into different territories to picket and to go on asking other members to go on strike. That would be jurisdictional. Closed shops are union shop situations where in order to get a job in this factory, you have to join the union first. So for example, if I apply for a job at the Nike factory and the Nike factory has a workers union in place, they won't even let me apply for the job until I join the union first. Now, the unions like this. The unions used to be able to negotiate these clauses into their contracts. And so these jurisdictional strikes were banned. I'm going to stop my sharing and check my video here to make sure that we are still recording. Okay, I'm going to go back. I just thought I had turned recording off. I'm going back to sharing my screen here. Hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. Closed shops banned wildcat strikes. And wildcat strikes are just strikes out of nowhere. And where, you'd get half of the union going on strike and half of the union not going on strike. And so these were actually banned as well. Because of the Taft-Hartley Act, what you're going to see is union membership since it was passed. Here's the red line. Here's the NLRB. All right, that first one that gave unions lots of rights. And you'll notice union membership increase. Then the Taft-Hartley Act is passed, which kind of limited, we just went over it, limited the powers of unions. And ever since, there's been a steady decline, and we could even take this out to 2020 and probably get to about 10% or less union membership in the 2020s now. So union membership has been steadily declining since that Taft-Hartley Act was passed at the end of 1947. So, okay, yeah, here is the explanations for each one of those. So I basically explained all of these: cooling off periods, secondary boycotts and pickets, right to work laws, jurisdictional strikes across different geography or industries, closed shops. You must join the union before being eligible to get a job in that factory. Wildcat strikes, when union members just go on strike without proper authorization from the full union. So since the Taft-Hartley Act, many other labor laws have been passed. We're not going to go into them. Union management still disagree. I mean, we still have labor relations issues all through the past several decades. We have had different industries have acts passed that ban specifically striking. For example, policemen and firemen are not allowed to, lights going off here. Policemen and firemen are allowed to go on strike. Air traffic control in the state of Michigan, it's illegal for teachers to go on strike. So we cannot, we have a union, but we cannot go on strike. That's not teachers in all states. Michigan specifically has a law that bans teachers from going on strike. Very big thing that happened in 1981 that limited the power of unions. Ronald Reagan, president at the time, got into a kind of a pissing match with the air traffic control union, and they basically were going on strike and shutting down all airline travel. They had a lot of power, and Reagan, basically the president, basically had them all fired and replaced them all. And that was a significant blow to unions in the 80s. This is also about the same time when the Hormel situation played itself out, where union members didn't get their way and management won. And those, as we remember from the story, those workers were eventually all replaced in that particular one. It made a lot of news. They showed news clips during that documentary. And of course, it was made into a documentary. So as you can see, union membership stands right around 10%, 12% in 2009, but now we're about 11 years later, 11 or 12 years later. So it's about down to 10% union membership. So I need you to know these terms. They are union shop clauses. These are clauses that are negotiated by the unions. They had so much power that they negotiated these clauses into the union contracts. The closed shop, which is now illegal, according to the Taft-Hartley Act, was that you must join the union before you could even apply for a job. You don't even know if you're going to get the job, but you'll be in the union. You'll pay the dues, for example. Then there's the union shop, which is very similar, but it forces the worker to join the union after they're hired. So once you get the job, you have to join the union. Right? This is powerful for the unions to be able to negotiate this stuff into the contract, that every single worker is going to be in the union. An agency shop, we had this in Michigan at one time. When I started teaching 28 years ago, 29 years ago, we had an agency shop. You were not compelled to join the union, but you had to pay the union dues. Kind of weird. You might as well just join the union. If you didn't join the union, your coworkers would be mad at you, but you still had to pay the dues. So you might as well just join the union if you were going to pay the dues. And some people who were very pro-union, they like these clauses that people have to band together. If you are anti-union, then you like these clauses. You don't like these clauses. You don't want to have to pay union dues. In 2012, Michigan passed a right to work law. We became what they call a right to work state in 2012. And so we are now an open shop state. You don't have to join the union if you don't want to. For example, the Roscommon Teachers Association, which is our own local union. And you're going to watch a video and read a story about us in just a few minutes after you finish this lecture. The Roscommon Teachers Association, we have probably about 60 teachers, K through 12, in our union, but we have only probably 2 or 3 teachers who have not joined the union, and so it's open. You don't have to join the union, and you don't have to pay the dues. Some terms I'd like to go over with you guys: picketing, strikes, lockouts, boycotts, collective bargaining, and CBA. Picketing is just basically, you can picket without going on strike. For example, you can still go to your job, but if you're unfair, you want to put public pressure on your boss, you'd walk around with these signs that say, hey, we want a contract, or we are opposing our pay cuts. Striking and picketing usually go together. You saw the workers in the Hormel strike picketing and striking. Striking is the not going to work part and not getting paid. And if you can get the entire union to go on strike, then you put a lot of economic pressure on the company to give you your way. And because you can close the factory down and do that. Okay, just grab one of each of those. A lockout is actually the opposite of a strike. A lockout is when management wants to put economic pressure on the workers and closes down the factory, believe it or not, because when you have a strike, both sides are losing. The management's losing because they're not building whatever it is built in the factory, and they're losing money, and the workers are not getting paid. All right, it's just like who can hold out longer. The National Hockey League, for example, is very famous for having a couple lockouts where the management, who are millionaires and billionaires, they're basically, hey, we're not going to play games. We're not going to pay you until you agree to this pay cut or whatever the terms are. A boycott is asking either your coworkers or your friends and family not to buy goods and services from your employer to put economic pressure. So if Hormel, for example, Hormel workers were going to boycott, they would tell their friends not to buy Spam, not to buy those Hormel meat products. Collective bargaining is what you do to get a CBA. So this is the teacher's contract. All right. And this is a CBA. This is a collective bargaining agreement, otherwise known as a contract. All right. And a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement, comes out of collective bargaining. What does that mean? That means like a group of people. I was a collective bargainer for the Roscommon teachers at one time. And we would pick 2 or 3 of our own, and we'd sit across from the boss and we'd say, we want a pay raise, or we want these kind of working conditions. And then they say yes or no, and we negotiate back and forth. That's called collective bargaining. And then whatever we bargain applies to everybody. So if we bargain a 2% raise, then everybody gets a 2% raise. If we bargain that everybody will report to work at 7:45, then everybody will report for work at 7:45. And CBAs generally are seniority based. Pay is seniority based, and there tend to be greater protection clauses on the working conditions. So when we say seniority based, this is good and this is bad. It's good as in the older workers with more experience get more pay. It's bad because you might lose your motivation. Just, stay there the longest and you'll get paid more. This is on the opposite of what we call merit pay. Merit pay is the best workers get the best pay. Most businesses pay based on merit and a combination of merit and seniority. We try to do merit pay in some unions. The more productive you are, you can get bonuses and so on and so forth. But in general, in most union collective bargaining agreements, CBAs, the pay is seniority based. And so if you were to look at the seniority based pay of the Roscommon teachers contract, what you would see is a pay scale. And that pay scale has different steps for how many years of experience and what your college degree is. All right, so the lowest paid teacher in Roscommon as of 19 and 20 would be $36,000 a year. I don't know if you guys can see that. And the highest paid would be one with more than 26 years experience and a master's degree. And that person would be at $69,000 a year. All right. And so it, for the most part, doesn't matter if you're a good worker or a bad worker. It's just how many years of experience you have. Some people say that's a good thing. Other people say that's a non-motivating factor. It's just like, all I'm really motivated to do is to just stay longer and longer and my pay will go up rather than being more productive and more productive. Some very prominent unions in the United States. I'm not going to go through these all, but the UAW, the United Auto Workers, United Mine Workers, AFL-CIO is a national worker union of lots of different unions, the American Federation of Labor, the Teamsters, that's truck drivers. Interesting how their name came about. The Teamsters originally were horse drivers, and they would drive a team of horses, and they would haul freight in these flatbed drays, they would call them, that were hauled by horses. And so Teamsters were the ones who would handle the horse teams. And those horse teams later became trucks. And so truck drivers, that's what Teamsters are. NEA, that's the National Education Association, that's teachers. UFC, Food and Commercial Workers, they were the ones we saw in the Hormel movie. And so those are some prominent unions, and that is the union lecture.